last night's Republican convention really was kind of lived up to a lot of the hype that people were expecting before. Everybody was real interested in hearing what Trump was going to say. His very first public statements since the assassination attempt on July 13th. And of course, then people are going to wonder, what is he going to stand for? Is he going to be different? A lot of that was on display last night. One of the things we want to talk about on this channel, though, because we really are focused on the international aspects of it, and that is what the Trump foreign policy could look like heading into what is increasingly looking likely to be a next Trump administration come January 2025. And to help break that down, we have a great guest with us today. You've seen him on before. It's been a while, though. Harry Kazianis. Harry, welcome. You're now currently the Senior Director at the Center for the National Interest, coming to us from Florida. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Danny. It's good to be with you as always.
And man, Harry, you've been covering Washington politics for decades, and certainly about Trump. And I know you've had some interaction with him in the past, so you really understand a lot of the things that he may be feeling. And one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on today is because you might be able to provide some good, I guess, background on what may be meant aside from what the actual sound bites are that people are saying. So really looking forward to getting your views on some of this stuff.
Sounds great. Sounds great.
And let me just ask you, because you're probably, was like a lot of other people, were kind of wondering what is going to be the vibe when he speaks last night. So first of all, I just wondered what your thoughts were on, since it's kind of such a trending topic, on his description of what happened to him on July 13th. How did that strike you?
Danny, it's funny. I'm a big advocate of therapy. I'm married to a therapist, so it's sort of built into my DNA. And I've written a lot of personal essays about the power of therapy and how important it is. What it felt like to me is it reminded me back of therapy sessions I did back before I moved to DC back around 2010, 2011, and talking about trauma. And for me, it felt like Donald Trump was literally having a therapy session with the entire world for everybody to sort of watch. And it was interesting what he said. He said, I don't want to talk about this again, but I sort of want to put it out there, what happened to me in my own story. And he literally walked the entire world through what he was going through. And it's funny, I think everybody's got a Donald Trump assassination story of where they were when it happened, or if they were watching or listening. And I have one. I mean, just very briefly, my wife and I were actually driving home from Universal Studios here in Florida. We were stuck in traffic. We left because there was a rainstorm. And normally we wouldn't be watching Fox News at 4 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon or whatever, but we had it on XM radio in our car driving back. And it was really interesting. He went off script. He said, if you watch the whole thing, it's interesting. He loves to go off script, but he literally said, okay, I forget the teleprompter. I'm going off script, and I'm just gonna ad lib this. And he put the chart up about illegal migration coming into the United States. And it was interesting. If he hadn't turned his head like he said he did, I mean, he would be dead. I mean, he was under attack by an AR-556 rifle. Anybody who knows an avid shooter like I am, I mean, that's a big bullet. That's gonna do some damage without being graphic. It would have killed him. And I remember my first reaction, I think his reaction probably was the same, was when you heard the amount of shots going off. I mean, I've been in a gun range long enough to know immediately that was a rifle, that there was multiple shots. My wife and I just looked at each other and said, "President's dead." And he probably thought that too. But when he grabbed his ear and went to the ground, I think he realized, I'm alive. I'm not dead. And I think for him, I think what he was trying to convey to people was that he had a second chance. I mean, it's hard for me not to get emotional about it, because my wife had a kidney transplant a few years ago, and she sort of went through this, but in a very different sense, different scenario. But that idea of having a second chance at life, I think for him was very powerful. And I think not only in that speech, Danny, but also during the convention, especially last night, that Donald Trump and his family opened up to the world to show themselves in a lot softer side that I think myself and other people have known about for a long time. Donald Trump many times has come across as very tough, as a fighter, and he showed that when he got back up and he pumped his fist in the air to show the world that he was okay. But I think we also have to remember too, he was probably showing his family that he was okay, to show to Don Jr., to Eric, to Laura, to his entire family that I'm here, I made it. And I think through the convention, he saw him sitting with his grandchildren,
Yeah.
how his facial expressions were very, very different. And I think he was trying to show the country that I'm a little different now. I have a little bit softer side to me. I want to show you that and show you maybe some of the different ways that I'm going to govern now. So I think for him, his speech was very intensely personal. And I'll be honest, Danny, I've been very sad on how the left and more of the quote unquote mainstream media outlets, portrayed this as like some sort of lost opportunity, that the speech was, an attack on Biden. I think it was the very first half of that speech was very personal, and it was great to see. It really was.
Well, that's a curious. I actually hadn't seen any of that. I mean, he only said the name Biden once, so I'm curious how that would come across. But whatever, I guess the people are going to do whatever they're going to do. Well, let's take a look then at some of these issues here, and how is it going to how is this new Donald Trump, or his new outlook on life, how might that affect a Trump foreign policy in the second term? Because I think that there's going to be, certainly there's a room for, if not even a good point, to have a soft side and a tough side at the same time in the president. We're going to see how some of that's going to play out. One of the things I want to start off with here and just kind of get your impression on is a video that played right before Trump went on. And, ordinarily these things are just, a bunch of puff piece, whatever, just to get everybody roused up before the big, the speech comes on. But this one I thought was different, because it's talking about, in this particular section you're seeing playing in the background here, where, he's the commander in chief, he's doing all this stuff, and it shows him talking to our allies, and then it shows him with Xi Jinping and with Vladimir Putin himself. And in the clip there, he doesn't shy away from the fact that he's willing to talk to anyone to get anything done. I mean, we could have put Kim Jong-un up there too. I was a little surprised they didn't have him in that as well. Because, the left has forever always said, oh, you cozy up to the dictators, whatever. But in his view, and this is what I'd like you to talk specifically about, first of all, how does he view talking to people, and does he actually cozy up to them, i.e. take their side? And because he's also been seen as being somewhat rough with our allies. And so how do you see those two things playing out?
Donald Trump takes a very personal view on diplomacy, on relationships. I think for him, personal interactions with world leaders and top officials and people, that principles that he is going to need to work with, is very, very important to him. Donald Trump likes to get to know people. He likes to understand them. Now, obviously, a lot of that is to get negotiating position. And I think, principles he's working with on other countries understand that, but Donald Trump is also giving them, pieces and little nuggets of information for them to get to know him as well. I think Donald Trump understands foreign policy from a very different vantage point than anybody else who's ever sat in the Resolute desk in the Oval Office. Let's be honest. And this is not an attack on Donald Trump. This is just the truth. He does not know what Jacksonian foreign policy is, or realism, or isolationism, or all these stupid DC foreign policy terms we all love to throw around. They're meaningless to him. What Donald Trump's most important thing that he thinks about is, how do I put the United States in the very best position to be the best country that it can be? How do I keep my people safe? How do I keep them secure? How do I keep the economy going? How do I make sure that people have good jobs and good livelihoods? That's how he approaches foreign policy, from that basic, place. He doesn't approach it from an ideological perspective. And he's had that perspective since the 1980s. It hasn't changed, to be honest with you. So that's where he stands. Now, talking with, world leaders that maybe we don't like, that have horrible human rights records, that launch foreign wars, that don't share our interests, whether we're talking about China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, whatever one you want to talk about. Donald Trump understands that to be successful at U.S. foreign policy and diplomacy, to move forward on all those things I just talked about, you have to have relationships with people that you really don't like, that people that make you want to just vomit in your mouth. I mean, that's the truth, right? But of
Right, right,
course,
right. And you know, and Harry, it's funny because you're talking about all these schools of foreign policy thought, et cetera. And it's ironic because in the past, and I mean, you can even go in the distant past in the U.S. We used to talk to everybody, whether we liked them, whether we didn't. I mean, you can just go to the Cold War and look at a lot of the people we talked to. I mean, that's the only reason the Cuban Missile Crisis was able to be resolved. And it used to be normal that you talk to people, sometimes even just behind, backdoor channels, whatever, those kind of things. But now it seems like, and it's been going on for a while now, that a lot of our leaders, they don't want to talk to anybody that they don't like. And it just puzzles me how anybody can say that American interests can be solved if you're not even talking to the people you don't like. Ergo, you have no ability to influence them in any way that could be beneficial to your country. I don't get that focus. And yet a lot of people seem to really think that's a good idea.
Nah, and I don't either. Let me give you an example, Danny, about the power of talking to your adversaries, because I think I'm going to bring in North Korea, and you probably knew I was going to do this because that's sort of my wheelhouse. But give you an example. For 30 years, the United States has had this policy of denuclearization on North Korea, and it's failed. Lots of reasons why, but good diplomacy with North Korea has always been very difficult. Why is that? It's because the United States has this insistence that we have working level talks. In other words, mid-level or upper level diplomats will engage in protracted negotiations somewhere around the world, and we've done this forever. And what happens? The negotiations occur. North Korean officials are scared to death of what they're going to bring back to Pyongyang, to the Kim family, and that they're going to get killed, and the negotiations fall apart. I think what Donald Trump figured out is that in order to have a negotiation with a country like North Korea, where he knows that it's only the Kim family and Kim Jong-un can make those decisions, whether it's to denuclearize, to have a relationship, to have dialogue, whatever, he had to talk to him directly. And I think Trump figured that out very, very quickly. And that was one of the reasons that those summits happened, those meetings along the DMZ, because Trump understood that there was no way that working level summits were going to do anything because of the nature of that regime. And that's just one instance right there where Donald Trump said, you know what? I know I'm going to catch political hell for this. People are going to mock me for working with one of the worst dictators in the world. But if I'm going to further America's interests, if I'm going to keep my country safe, if I'm going to try and get the North Koreans to give up any part of their nuclear program, and or get anywhere near denuclearization, this is the step I'm going to have to take. And I think during a second Trump administration, I think you're going to see Trump talk to a lot of leaders that people don't like. Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, Kim Jong-un, Xi Jinping, whoever, because that's the only way that you're going to advance America's interests. Doesn't mean you like these people, but in foreign policy, you have to deal with the horrible reality of what it is.
You have. Yeah, we don't get to choose other people's leaders, so we got to engage on whatever if we're going to do anything beneficial for the United States. Okay, so given that, I want to look, first of all, kind of at the 30,000-foot level of Trump. So he talked a little bit about foreign policy last night, but it kind of in general terms. So I pulled out this one clip here, and wonder if you can kind of interpret for us your best guess on what he may have meant, because he's going to mention two general concepts here. One is the border, and number two is just international relations. What do you think he's conveyed in this? Watch this.
Tonight, America, this is my vow. I will not let these. American life was stolen by a criminal alien set free by this administration. And these were incredible people we're talking about. These were incredible people who died. Tonight, America, this is my vow. I will not let these killers and criminals into our country. I will keep our sons and daughters safe. As we bring security to our streets, we will help bring stability to the world. I was the first president in modern times to start no new wars. You know, we were the toughest. We were the most respected. And you saw this. Hungry, strong country, run by a very powerful, tough leader. Tough guy. Press doesn't like him because he's tough. And he came out recently. They were asking him at an interview, the whole world is exploding. What's happening? What's going on? Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary, very tough man. He said, I don't want people coming into my country and blowing up our shopping centers and killing people. But they said to him, tell us what's going wrong, what's happening, What is it? He said, there's only one way you're going to solve it. You got to bring President Trump back to the United States because he kept everybody at bay.
So I know, and we'll start with the second part first, since that's what he just got through saying. When he's talking about Viktor Orban, Orban just came for the second time this year, if I'm not mistaken, to see President Trump at Mar-a-Lago. So one would seem to think that they're on nearly the same page in terms of war and peace in Europe.
I think so. I mean, I don't know what those discussions look like, but I can tell you that I think Donald Trump understands when it comes to foreign policy, is mission one for him is going to be figuring out what to do. Number one, to lower the temperature in the Ukraine war, and then figuring out some way to get the guns from stopping from firing. I don't think, at least from my own personal view, I don't think that the Trump administration and those around him right now, I think they have a sense that there isn't going to be easy solutions. I mean, both sides have lost thousands and thousands of people. The temperatures are running hot on both sides, whether it's in Moscow or Kiev. And I think for Trump, I think the first thing that he's probably going to try and do, again, no inside knowledge, my own perspective, is that I think a ceasefire would be probably the most prudent place to start. I don't think Volodymyr Zelensky is going to be very happy with that. I don't know why that is, that the balance of forces is very much largely against him. So one would think that he would welcome that. But I think that's what Trump is going to try to push for, and try to push for very quickly. I think Trump understands that there may not be an easy solution that will take weeks, months, or maybe even years. I think he probably has an understanding, and from those around him are probably explaining to him that we may end up in a situation where there is some sort of Korean War style, not even settlement, but basically both sides agree to disagree and the lines essentially stay where they are. Maybe there's some sort of demilitarized zone, both sides, there would be occasional flare-ups. What could end up being the imperfect solution for a very imperfect problem, Danny, is that both sides neither want to give, anything up. So they agree to basically leave things in place. And it ends up becoming a very dangerous, the biggest frozen conflict in the world. That makes me very uncomfortable, but knowing how both sides are so dug in politically and geopolitically, neither side wants to appear like they've lost.
So let me ask you this. Well, we're going to get into some specifics in a little bit, but since you kind of opened up that door, let's just run it for a second, because the risk to that mentality, I guess, is that Russia says, yeah, we're not equal. We're not, it's not a stalemate. We have the balance of power, which you just mentioned too. And so what do you think Trump would do if he gets a ceasefire or whatever, to talk about it, or that he doesn't in Moscow says, yeah, I'm just going to keep going. So I'm not even going to ceasefire because I'm going to take if I can't get it through negotiations, I'm going to take it on the battlefield. And by all accounts, it looks like they do have the capacity to do that. And that might put Trump in a tough situation.
I think it could. I think Trump would gamble a little bit there to try and bring some sort of peace to Ukraine and to Europe. I think Trump would be very clear with Putin and explain to him and say, look, don't test my patience. We are going to honestly try to have a ceasefire, and I'm going to personally do all I can to create the conditions for honest diplomacy and to try and come up with a solution that all sides agree on. And if we can't, then maybe this potential Korean War sort of armistice sort of situation might be the best option. But I think if Vladimir Putin were to use that to cheat, whether it be militia groups that he tries to say are starting it, or lie and say, oh, our forces aren't doing anything, I think that would be a big mistake, because I think when Donald Trump feels like he got quote unquote screwed over, excuse my language, I think that might be something where he starts to unleash a lot more firepower and give the Ukrainians more of what they want. And you could even see, Danny, him maybe even preface that and say, I'm taking a little bit of a leap of faith here and giving up some political capital, knowing, Democrats, hawkish Republicans, they're not going to like that I'm doing this with Moscow and trying to come to some sort of settlement. So understand those political realities, and that I have the ability as president to do a lot, but if you test me and make me look like a fool, I will respond.
Okay, so here's another this with very, very realistic probability, if not a certainty, is that when let's say it's behind closed door, and that Trump and Putin are talking, whether it's in person or on the phone, and Putin says, "Okay, but my non-negotiable is a unaligned Ukraine rump. Whatever is left, whatever's on the other side of that line, it's got to be unaligned with NATO," which would be a radical turnaround from what we have been pursuing for the last 2.5 years. Would Trump be willing to entertain that?
My own personal opinion is yes. I think a lot of my colleagues on the Republican side feel that Ukraine must be part of NATO. It's sacrosanct. It has to get done. Look, I think it's very clear, Danny, that Ukraine is now firmly in the Western camp. I think Vladimir Putin, irregardless of how we look at the conditions on the battlefield, who won, who lost, what the measures of all that look like. I think one of the things that is not going to change now is Ukraine is aligned with the West. I think it'll be Western technology, Western companies, Western capital, Western loans that will rebuild Ukraine and literally build its infrastructure geared towards everything that is inclusive in the West. They may not be a part of NATO, but their military technology, their training, their doctrine, their eventual training in combined armed warfare and all of these type of things will be based on the West. So in that respect, Vladimir Putin has lost that. The number one thing that he was afraid of, a Ukraine aligned with the West, has happened. I don't think you need to have Ukraine as part of NATO. I don't think that's something that we have to do, and that's Vladimir Putin's big fear. So if Trump was to take that off the table, and that was something that would push them into a settlement, that's fine. I think Putin understands that if he was to renew his invasion of Ukraine again, I think it's very clear that Trump or whoever's in the White House and Europeans would help NATO Ukraine again. So I think the contours of what a deal looks like are all there. It's just going to take some political courage to get there.
And I think Harry, I mean, you can certainly see the way this thing has gone on since 2014, not just 2022, is that Putin really had shown. I think he's willing to live with a Ukraine that is leaning towards the West, as long as it's not military connected to the West. That seemed to be his absolute non-negotiable red line. So if anything could be negotiated separate or that comes short of that, then I think from his perspective, he might be willing to negotiate. But interestingly enough, because Gary pulled up this something here that Trump has previously said, when someone would point blank ask him, would you be willing to take Putin's positions and just adopt them? First of all, let me show you what he said, then we'll talk about it on the backside.
Are Putin's terms acceptable to you? Keeping the territory in Ukraine?
No, they're not acceptable.
So that's his position, that they're not acceptable. And they had just talked about what Putin's, I think it was his 5 June comments or 6 June, where he said, here's my new offer of a negotiated settlement, which was not good for Ukraine, had to give up all 4 of the oblasts, et cetera. So it's best that you can divine into the deal-making Trump. So anytime normal discussions, whether it's business or in international relations, it's like, all right, I'm going to put up my, best case scenario first and my optimal case first, so that then I can negotiate backwards from that. Or so do you think that's what Trump was doing right there? Or do you think he's actually saying, no, I'm not going to give Putin any of the land that he wanted?
I think Trump is a realist in the respect that he understands that battlefield conditions are going to dictate what he can and cannot get. The balance of forces, as you've pointed out in the show countless times, Danny, and to your credit, Russia has the industrial capacity to outmatch us for a long period of time when it comes to just basic munitions like artillery shells and other things. I read a very interesting statistic the other day, and that 40% of Russia's economy is now geared towards the war in Ukraine. That's pretty incredible when you think about a $1.5 trillion economy. So it's very clear that just on the numbers, we can't match these things. And I think Donald Trump knows that. So what do you do about that? I think for him, the first thing that he's going to try and do is, again, so I don't know if it would be necessarily an armistice, but to get to both sides to stop the fighting. I think that's step number one, to create conditions where both sides can have some trust, to bring them together and to try and see what can be negotiated. yes, Ukraine is probably going to lose some territory. I know that blows people's mind. I know that's extraordinarily sad. It's horrible. Unfortunately, if you look at the totality of world history,
Right.
countries do lose territory. It sucks, excuse my language again, but it may be something that we're going to have to
Well,
live
it
with.
is, Harry, and what I argue strenuously, and have been for most of the duration of this war, is that by not acknowledging that historical reality and the ground truth that exists right now, by saying we're going to have a negotiated settlement that gives up, whatever some percentage of the land that's there now, the longer you delay that, the less likely you are to hold on to that land, and that you could lose even more. That's what I think the other side doesn't get enough, is that this unwillingness to acknowledge that reality is actually costing Ukraine in the long term, because the balance of power is not going to be moved off. I don't want to dwell too long on this because we got some other things to pick up here, but I want to move on here because part of the Trump foreign policy, I think, was expressed in who he selected as his vice presidential nomination in Senator J.D. Vance. So I'm going to show a couple of things that Vance has said, some of which we've used on this show in the past as an example of what's right. So what's just why I'll just publicly say I was all for this. Was my number one choice for vice president all along, other than maybe Tulsi Gabbard. I actually would have preferred her for some other reasons too. But this is a really good one because J.D. Vance, I like his mentality. I like the way he thinks through things and the way he acknowledges things on the ground, based on what we want to accomplish policy-wise, et cetera. Everybody doesn't agree with that, though. Here is Rachel Maddow talking about J.D. Vance is this radical person that we should all be afraid of.
Trump has already effectively pledged that the U.S. will switch sides in this war if he is elected. He has gone so far as to say that he will tell Russia that they can do, quote, whatever the hell they want to any of our NATO allies once he's president. But even so, of all the choices that Trump could have made for his running mate, Senator J.D. Vance is the single most radical choice he could have made on this issue. Senator Vance has said bluntly that he is opposed to virtually any proposal for the U.S. to continue funding this war. Vance said even more bluntly, quote, I don't really care what happens to Ukraine one way or the other, which understandably has Ukraine and the rest of Europe and everyone who cares about the biggest European war since the Nazi era, since World War II, has everyone a little freaked out about the prospect of a Vice President J.D. Vance.
Now, I'm going to let JD speak for himself. We have some of his comments here coming up shortly, but I think that one of the reasons why I selected this quote from Maddow is that it shows that the folks who are on that side of the argument, and some of those are also on the right, so it's not even a Republican-Democrat issue, but those who think we should continue to support Ukraine no matter what, don't understand what we have been talking about here, which even the headline they put on there from Vance really shows that the math doesn't work. It doesn't matter how much money you give Ukraine because they don't have the manpower. It's manpower, ultimately, not money. You can't print manpower, even if you can print a few dollars. But then there's other issues too. Even our own weapon systems and our own ammunition and our own capacity compared to what you just described from the Russian side, we just can't match it unless we go on a full war footing, which we're not going to do. I can't imagine Trump would ever go to that path for something that's not in our national interest. But I just wonder if you could speak a little bit on how the other side of this views it and this fear that they have about reaching a negotiated settlement.
I think there's a lot of internationalist Republicans, internationalists like a Rachel Maddow, that take this viewpoint that Ukraine, quote unquote, has to win the war. What does that mean? I think we need to break that down for a second. There's this dream that somehow Ukraine is going to march through and take back all the territory that Russia's gained over the last few years, and that somehow Ukraine is going to magically get the military capabilities to take back Crimea. And then maybe even because of the collapse of Russian military power, which I don't know how that's going to happen, that Putin will fall from power and Russia will become a democracy. I mean, look, like Joe Biden said it himself a few years ago when he went, I think it was to Poland, and said, Vladimir Putin's got to go. Something, I'm paraphrasing. Maybe that was a senior
He said,
moment.
my God, this man can't remain in office.
Yes,
remember
that. That's it. And I think that's the dream of sort of these neoliberal internationalists, that the war in Ukraine can win somehow, and that Putin falls from power. Look, I wish that could happen. I do too, but it's it's not reality. I've seen some private estimates, Danny, from other strategists who worked on this that have circulated in Republican circles to try and make the point of what can happen with Ukraine, what it would actually take for quote unquote Ukraine to win under that scenario I just mentioned. I've seen estimates like $1.5 trillion, $1.75 trillion. I've seen something like several thousand M1 Abrams tanks, giving the Ukrainians F-35 and F-22 fighter jets. I mean, we're talking about
will never be a
levels.
victory for Russia, for free people refused to live in a world of hopelessness and darkness. We will have a different future, a brighter future, rooted in democracy and principles, hope and light, of decency and dignity, of freedom and possibilities. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power.
In case you wanted to know.
Yeah, I mean, that's that for me. I was terrified when that came out. I mean, look, I don't want Vladimir Putin to be the head of Russia. He has 5,000 nuclear warheads under his control, countless tactical nuclear weapons. But at the same time, again, this goes to back what we were just talking about. In foreign policy, you have to work with the hand that you're dealt. You just can't play, foreign policy fairyland and just pretend that that you don't have, you don't that you don't have to deal with
fairyland. That's good.
we have no choice. I mean, Richard Nixon was great at this. Another Republican foreign policy realist who had to make very, very tough choices when America was in a very, very difficult foreign policy position, when our economy was struggling, we were getting out of Vietnam. He had to open the door to China and make other moves. So, talking.
Yeah, and he had to downgrade Taiwan. Which was a very unpopular move among many, but he made the hard choice that was necessary, which ultimately benefited both countries in time and et cetera. But we foreign policy fairyland. I'm going to have to remember that one. But like I said, I'm going to let Senator Vance speak for himself. So here's what he says in counter to what Maddow was talking about there. Tell me if this looks like a radical to you.
The average age of a soldier in the Ukrainian army right now is 43. That's tragic. That's older than me. I'm 39. If this thing goes on a little bit longer, the average age of a Ukrainian soldier is going to be older than you, and then a year later it could be Wolf Blitzer. That is a tragedy. What does it look like?
I don't like this age graph thing.
I'm sorry, Jake.
Go. I'm 54 for those wondering.
We are getting to a place where we're going to be functionally on the hook to pay for Ukrainian pensioners, to rebuild the entire country. Right. We need to bring the killing to a stop, and that's what American leadership should be doing, not writing more blank checks to the war. You cannot occupy an entire territory the size of Ukraine with the amount of troops that Russia has. The idea that you can go even further and control multiple European nations is, I think, a scare tactic to get people distracted from the fact that our Ukraine policy just doesn't make a ton of sense.
And there he sums it up right there. Look, we can't write checks to forever for another country. Russia doesn't have the capacity to roll into Western Europe. They would never do so because of the nuclear weapon issue anyway. So all of that is a fear that has no rational basis. And what we should be doing is stopping the killing, to your point earlier.
I don't understand what Rachel Maddow is getting so upset about. I mean, having this mentality that we can't win every war, we can't beat every bad guy. I mean, I think this is the mentality, Danny, that got us into Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, countless other, foreign policy, disasters that we've been part of for 25 years. And I think J.D. Vance has a very nuanced worldview. I mean, this is somebody who grew up in poverty, worked his way out of poverty, which is a miracle, served in the U.S. Marine Corps. I'm going to assume saw combat. I don't know if that's true, but I think that seems to color his worldview.
He did serve in Iraq for 6 months in a not a combat unit, but he did serve in a combat zone.
Okay. So that definitely, I think, for people, I've always noticed, Danny, that people who have seen blood flow, who have seen their comrades fall, who have at least witnessed that, it changes perspective, and I think it should, to be honest with you. And I think for JD, I think he understands that this war is not going to end in a way that the West is going to be happy about. So how do you end it in a way that's honorable for both sides to back off? And I think he understands correctly about Russia. And I think if he was to take that point further, look, Russia's a declining and dying power. I mean, that is the truth here. If you look at their demographics, if you look at their industry, if you look at whatever they have in terms of innovation, they don't have any of that. And I think there is a possibility someday that maybe Russian democracy or something better comes along after Putin passes. I think that's all possible. But at the same time, that's not where we are now. And I think JD understands that. And I think for him, he sees bigger challenges on the horizon. And I think what he's more worried about, I think if you really press him, Danny, I think what he's scared about, and a lot of conservatives like myself, is that the greatest problem for the United States isn't some external Russia or even China or something like that. It's the problems we have here at home. And I think what he's begging people to do is just try to start working on those problems. I mean, he being in poverty in Appalachia, I think he understands that better than anybody else, because, he's part of that generation of people who were in flyover country, who lost all those jobs, who lost hope. And he's lucky that he was able to get out of it. And that's why I said during his speech, I'm not going to forget about those people. And I think that's a reflection of his foreign policy views.
Yeah, so that obviously appeals to quite a number of people. It appeals to Donald Trump. That's why he ended up selecting him, I imagine. But it doesn't appeal to everyone. And Maddow's not the only one. Here's somebody else who's not real fond of J.D. Vance.
J.D. Vance, who has said in the past that he doesn't really care what happens in Ukraine one way or another. What do you make of those remarks?
Maybe he really doesn't understand what goes on in Ukraine. So for us, we have to work with the United States. And if new team will come, we have to work with them. We need their support.
Hard work, I guess.
Hard work.
Could be hard work to persuade
yes,
them.
But we don't afraid of hard work.
So you see, he was searching for just the right words to say, rather different than the ones I imagined that first came to his mind. But look, part of me gets it from his perspective, because he's been told all the way from the beginning, and let's go back to April or March, April of 2022, when we thought we had a negotiated settlement on the books. And even Zelensky had publicly stated that he was willing to consider neutrality status in exchange for ending the war. And then somebody changed his mind. And from that point forward, he's been told blanket by all the Western leaders, just keep going. We'll keep supporting you for as long as it takes. And now all of a sudden there could be a change of guard, and he's panicking, I think.
I think so. And I think, teasing out a little bit further, Danny, I mean, let's say Trump does win. I can see a scenario where Donald Trump selects a special envoy, that him or her, that person would go to Kiev and say to Volodymyr, say, look, what realistically are your goals right now for the next 3 to 6 months? What do you think you can honestly achieve? What would you need from us to achieve that? If you do achieve that, what happens after that? Like, I think there needs to be some very hard discussions in Kiev about what their goals are, what the end of the conflict looks like. Because what you're not going to hear from Donald Trump is we're going to win and we're going to fight until the end. You're not going to hear that from him. You're going to hear a very clear-eyed, asking very detailed questions about where this conflict is going and what does the end state look like. If people start telling Donald Trump, look, Mr. President, there's no way that, Crimea and these territories are coming back to Ukraine, more people are going to die, I think Trump is going to very quickly say, okay, then we need some sort of settlement to end this war. Because I think what Trump understands is that Ukraine is essentially like a global cancer, and it's creating power vacuums there that are spreading all over the world. I mean, for example, Russia needs armaments to fuel this war. It can't provide them all on its own. So it's going to Iran to get drones. It's going to North Korea to get munitions. That in turn is helping, Iran get fighter jet technology from the Russians. It's helping the North Koreans, I'm sure, getting missile technology for their weaponry and their ICBMs. Those ICBMs can hit the United States. So I think for Trump, I'm pretty sure that he probably sees the Ukraine conflict as a bigger global problem that has tentacles that reach out all over the world. And
right. And fewer people see that. And in fact, here is what Trump did say on that very subject.
The money that we're spending on this war, and we shouldn't be spending, it should have never happened. I will have that war settled between Putin and Zelensky as president-elect before I take office on January 20th. I'll have that war settled.
Yeah, as we talked about, until you have power, you really can't do anything. But yeah, I get your bigger point there. But he is showing categorically where his mind is on this. This is not just it's not just JD Vance. That just kind of added another cog in it. But going back to that interview with Zelensky, well, let's just say that he had a Biden moment at the beginning. Watch this.
When Donald Trump said last year that he thought this war could end within 24 hours if he was to meet both you and Vladimir Putin, what did you make of that?
So everybody will be happy if one person in the world doesn't depend Donald Trump or not. Okay, Donald Trump. If one person in the world, and this person Donald Trump, can stop the war during 24 hours. The question is, what the price and who will pay?
So, yeah, look, again, I understand, because also Zelensky has other issues involved as well. And he's got his own ultra-nationalists that he has to deal with. And there's been more than just one report that there are many who have claimed that if you start going down the path of negotiated settlement, it'll be a short path because you might not survive it. And I think we can't dismiss that is a very real possibility among some in his camp. And you see that really pained look on his face when he was trying to answer that. Again, a lot of things he didn't say, but they may have wanted to. But then to continue on there, he talked about what that price would be.
His idea to push us to pay. But if he wants to do it during 24 hours, the simple way is to push us to pay. Because it's understandable how. It means just stop and give. And forget. Sanctions out, everything out. Putin will take the land. Putin will make a victory for his society. We will never go on this. Never. And there is no any guy in the world who can push us to do it.
Okay. Now, he has a certain point. He is the leader of his country. And so Trump doesn't have any authority there if he should win. But if Zelensky wants to go on a path without the American support, I'm not sure how far he would go down that road.
I don't know, Danny. I mean, I think for all sides here, I think what Trump is, he's talking about this 24-hour, peace thing. I think more of what he's talking about is really some sort of like handshake sort of armistice where both sides sort of stop the fighting to allow an exploration of diplomacy. I think that's what my gut tells me he's really talking about. I don't think he's going to solve it within 24 hours, but I think that's where he's hinting at. And I think in the final, when the history is written of the Ukraine war, I think it's going to be clear both sides lost a lot. I think for Zelensky, I think they're going to lose some territory. And I think for the Russians, I mean, how many hundreds of billions of dollars did it cost them? I've seen estimates where 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 Russians were killed or wounded, and that's obviously going to go up with each passing day. Their entire military took a massive bruising to the point where they're sending out T-62 and T-64 tanks that are 60 years old. I mean, it's going to cost them hundreds of billions of dollars to now modernize that equipment if that's what they decide to do. Plus, like I said before, Ukraine, Russia lost its ultimate goal because Ukraine will now become part of the West. So, both sides lost. So for Zelensky to say, if it requires us giving up territory, I'm not going to do it. Well, you might see Donald Trump say, well, you might want to go look to Berlin or Paris or Brussels for all those armaments that you want. And we all know they haven't exactly built a lot of them over the years. So, that might. And
I worry. One of the reasons why I was such a proponent of finding that negotiated settlement in Istanbul in April 2022 was because at that moment, at that time, and even later in 22, Russia was severely gouged. They had lost a lot of troops. They'd lost a lot of equipment. Their economy was damaged a little bit, but their industrial capacity had not yet kicked in. So it was all a net loss. But since that time, those things have been recovered. And now that they're actually starting to produce a lot of stuff, and they have a plan, by all accounts, to continue going on even once this is done. So the net, and I think the longer the war goes, the stronger Russia ends up, at least conventionally, militarily, which is another big reason to get this deal punched off right away. But we'll see what happens with that. A lot of things have to happen. Trump even has to win the election first of all, and we don't want to guarantee anything. But those are some of the concerns. Now, in the amount of time we have left, a couple of other things I want to talk about. I want to do kind of a lightning round with you, and just kind of throw some foreign policy issues out there and what you think Trump might do in those areas, because they're all really important. First of all, China. So he has a kind of a sordid relationship and history with China, especially on the economic realm. Then there's also the potential for China-Taiwan conflict, which Biden has said several times could actually involve the United States. So big question. We'll take it in pieces here. First of all, what will Trump do on China in terms of the overall policy?
Look, I don't think, Danny, he'll be as hawkish as he was on China. I think he understands that things a little bit with China have changed. COVID did a lot of damage to their economy. Their demographics are really bad. They're not the economic juggernaut that, 10, 15 years ago, Fareed Zakaria and everybody else was telling us that they were going to be. So bottom line, I think there will be, concerns about China in the larger Indo-Pacific. But I think what Trump will try and do is to pressure and persuade our allies like Japan, South Korea, partners like Taiwan, Vietnam, others, that the best strategy to try and contain any Chinese, negative actions that they might do, whether in the South China Sea and others, is to continue to grow their military capabilities, to understand that the Chinese have developed all these anti-access capabilities. Well, we can use that same strategy right back at them and contain their aspirations and nullify a lot of these military advances. So I think Trump sees sort of maybe a little bit cheaper way to do it, not expend as much American blood and treasure, and sort of to try and classically contain the problem. And I think you'll see a little bit less rhetoric from him. I think he's got a lot of other things he's got to work out. This might not be the biggest foreign policy issue that he has to deal with.
Okay, so real quick, or relatedly, Taiwan. Let's say that for reasons that none of us can control, somebody on Taiwan, the current leader or some other leaders there, make overt or something close to declarations of independence, or that makes China think that's what they're going to do, and China actually moves. Will Trump send the United States to war against China over Taiwan?
No, I think what you would see for him is he wouldn't quote unquote abandon Taiwan, but I think what he would do is try to help them in defensive armaments as best he can. Now, that's a big question. It would depend on a lot of the nitty-gritty circumstances of how that all fell into play. But I think Trump would be helpful. I think the Chinese would get bloodied pretty badly in that conflict. Could end up being like Ukraine 2.0. That's a whole other issue. But I think he would help, but I don't think he would be eager to send American men and women to die. I think he'd send armaments, but I think is he going to send, the U.S. aircraft carriers over there or something like that? I don't think so, at least not initially.
Well, I certainly hope that continues on. North Korea, you mentioned this a little bit at the top of the show here. One of the things that I wanted to specifically ask you, which could be complicated, is because according to many reports, Kim Jong-un felt like he lost a lot of face in his dealing with Trump because of, we can talk about this another time, but many of Trump's people who were with him, John Bolton being one of the key ones, I think kind of undermined what Trump was doing and led him in a bad direction to not make that deal at Hanoi, which we talked about that in 2018. But because of that, the reports are that Kim Jong-un might be less willing to negotiate and to discuss things with Trump. How do you see that playing out?
I don't see the North Koreans being eager to negotiate with Trump now, or at least for the next year plus, because of the amount of money, equipment, and aid they're getting from the Russians right now. We don't know how much that is, Danny, but I'm willing to wager it's worth at least several $1 billion a year. I bet you they're probably getting food aid, help on their missile program, reentry of their missiles, and so on. So unless the Ukraine war was to grind to a halt and that aid from Russia were to dry up, I don't think the North Koreans are going to want to talk. The North Koreans right now are in a pretty good position. They're getting aid from Russia. They're getting sanctioned help from the Chinese. Things for Kim Jong-un are in a good place. Why would he be eager to make any deals with Donald Trump? And
so what about Trump's interest? Does Trump have an interest or a motivation to try and I don't know, force the issue seems a strong word, but to try and engage with negotiation? Or would he be content with just letting things play out however they play out?
It depends on what the North Koreans do. If the North Koreans start testing ICBMs, keep in mind that's what really set off Donald Trump before he took the oath of office. I think it was back in December of 2016. We started tweeting about this, saying the North Koreans will never have an ICBM, and they were starting to test missiles, and that got him very alerted. And then the Obama administration briefed him in the Oval and explained the dangers of North Korea. And something like that isn't going to happen. But if the North Koreans weren't to sort of go back to having a moratorium on ICBM testing, that might trigger a Donald Trump response. I don't know that that's going to happen. He may end up taking a very Biden-esque view and saying, well, there's not a lot I can do about this unless I expend a ton of political capital and maybe not get a lot in return. But again, I'm going to go back to what I said, Danny. I really think what happens with the Ukraine war is the key here. If the Russians shut off the taps, if you will, I think the North Koreans will probably want to talk.
Got it. Okay, moving on to the next topic here. Another one with some history for Trump, and that is Iran. So he pulled us out of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal in 2018. Iran has now significantly expanded its capacity in that regard, even though it still hasn't allegedly gone into a weapons-making program. But what is Trump going to want to do with Iran? Because many in the Republican camps and the conservative camps are still aggressive and hawkish towards Iran and wanting somebody to do something over there. What's Trump going to do with Iran?
It's simple. I think he's going to go back to what he did before. I think he's going to apply sanctions. He's going to apply economic pressure. I think he's going to go to allies and partners or any nations that are buying Iranian oil and say the same things, that if you're going to make those deals with Tehran, we're not going to be a very good business partner to you, and we're going to apply tariffs, sanctions on you, perhaps. I think he's going to go back to that old playbook that he felt worked appropriately. I do think that he's very incensed and upset about the threats that have been made on Mike Pompeo and Robert O'Brien. I think these are people that are very close to him, that he really has very, very close relationships with. And I think that's in the back of his mind. So I think for him, he's going to go back to that old playbook. It's going to be difficult to see how effective that will be because the world has moved on a lot since then. But I think that's the initial impulse.
Okay, and then now on to not an adversary per se, and that is on NATO. Now, many in people in both the United States and in the West always accused Trump of wanting to get rid of NATO, wanting to ban it or quit funding it, et cetera. And Trump is, he did say that one time about, Russia can do whatever the hell it wants. If they don't pay up, I don't know if I'll defend them or whatever. What are NATO allies to make of a Trump 2.0 NATO policy?
I think this is the easiest question you've asked me. To be honest with you, it's simple. He just wants a NATO alliance that's strong, that's militarily vibrant, that can produce munitions if it needs to in a crisis, that has capable airmen, sailors, soldiers, Marines that are well trained, that have the equipment that they need, and that it isn't always the United States that has to backstop everything that NATO does. I mean, just a quick example, look at the Royal Navy. I mean, their aircraft carriers don't work half the time. I mean, look at the German military. Their Air Force has all these different types of mechanical problems. Go back 10 years ago, and there was a time for, I think, a year where they couldn't even deploy one submarine when they had one of the best submarine forces in the world, obviously going back to World War I, World War II, the Cold War. They exported submarines all over the world. So I think for Trump, he sees this and says, why do we need to be the spine of NATO and backstop it with all the military equipment and guarantees when the EU is almost as big of an economic juggernaut as the United States? And I think that angers him and enrages him. And he says, you need to, he oversimplifies it, but he does that for political expediency. He wants NATO to be strong, and he's not going to back off if countries aren't going to be willing to do the hard work and pay the money and resources to getting up to that 2% GDP goal. He's not going to back off that. And he's not going to be nice about it either. And I'm glad, to be honest with you. It's about time.
Yeah, certainly a lot of people agree with that. A lot of people are terrified of that too. But I personally think that it's long overdue that there needs to be some changing in there. I think the United States still has significant interest in what happens in Europe, but I think we should be the backstop, not the leading edge on it. So when Biden bragged a week or so ago, and maybe even during that debate, I can't remember, that there's 100,000 Americans in Europe, and because of what was happening in Russia, Ukraine, we sent our guys to the front and all these battalion groups all the way to the flank. I'm like, what? Why did America need to do that? How about the countries that are there who are on the front line? If they're concerned about it, they should bump up what they do. They should apply maybe German and French battalions on the eastern flank of NATO. Why Americans? So I'm okay with moving in that direction and still maintaining a capacity, at least for the time being. But we'll see how that plays out. Last thing I want to talk about here, because it's definitely trending here and could have some definite ramifications for whether Trump does win, and that is the issue with Joe Biden. Last night, actually just before Trump spoke, the Five on Fox News had what they call some breaking news. Watch this.
President Obama is telling allies that Joe Biden needs to step aside. Marie, the exact language is seriously consider his viability. You said 2 minutes ago, we're waiting to hear from Obama. Well, we're hearing from him through the pages of the Washington Post.
Yeah, I just got chills when you read that. You know, I worked for President Obama, as you know, and he has very good political instincts. He has throughout this process. He's also very cautious, though, Kayleigh. So throughout the days since the debate, he has stood by Joe Biden, but I think started to hear increasingly from people that believe there is no path for President Biden to win.
To me, when I heard, because we've been hearing in recent days about Schumer, about Schiff, even about Pelosi, Jeffries, all these big players in the Democratic Party were all saying either overtly it's time to think about somebody new, or in Pelosi's case, unwilling to say, I'm going to give Joe Biden my backing. But when Obama comes out and says, hey, man, it's time to step down, to me, that was the last piece. I don't see how he can avoid dropping out now. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many questions, Danny. I mean, I think the first thing is, I think if Joe Biden stays in, he's going to lose. That's it. It's just, how historic is this loss going to be? Is this Reagan 1984 sweep? Is this, Obama winning in 2012 sort of victory? It's tough to tell, but it's over. But I think for Biden, I think for him now, he's trying to figure out, okay, if I do decide to stand down, what happens after? And there's a lot of questions I think that need to be answered. I think the most obviously one for me is, does Joe Biden resign the presidency altogether? I mean, if we're going to say that the man can't run for president, the logical next thing to say is that he can't be president at all. And we can, experts can argue what is wrong, what his cognitive state is, does he have dementia, Alzheimer's? Is he just aging poorly? But I think the next question is that he would have to step aside. That's my own opinion. Kamala Harris would need to take the reins of power. There'd have to be a vice president that would be, would get Senate confirmation. Obviously, that would suck up a lot of political energy. And my own opinion where this goes is that Biden stands down, but doesn't, resign the presidency. He stays in. And I think what the media will do is start this whole love affair with Kamala Harris, shine her up as much as they possibly can in terms of, her political image, and forget some of the problems that she's had throughout the years. Mainly that her staffing never stays with her, that she's made a lot of poor choices as a senator, that she's left of Bernie Sanders, which I think once people start really poking through her views in terms of politics, a lot of people aren't going to like those views. But I think you will see Donald Trump numbers, fall back a little bit. I think he'll still be in the pole position. And then I think this naturally goes to, what the debates would be like. But it's hard to see Donald Trump losing at this point. I mean, literally, when you survive like a gunshot wound to the head, I don't really see how, if somebody's willing to go that far to try and bring good to the country, regardless of whether you don't like the man's views, I think the sympathy vote for Donald Trump is going to be intense. And I think there's a lot of people out there, Danny, who don't want to admit that they like Donald Trump. I was one of them, to be honest with you. I was there, not recently, but years ago.
Yeah. Well, let's look at one other aspect of this, though, because the money is on Kamala Harris being elevated to the top spot on the ticket. They would have to find another vice presidential candidate, et cetera. But apparently, within the Democratic Party, there is not unanimity on that. As Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez put in this video today, kind of angry about what she's hearing. Watch this.
If you think that there is consensus among the people who want Joe Biden to leave, that they will support Vice President Harris, you would be mistaken. And I'm going to say that because if they're going to come out and say all their little things on background off the record, but they're not going to be fully honest, I'm going to be honest for them. I'm in these rooms. I see what they say in conversations. A lot of them are not just interested in removing the president. They are interested in removing the whole ticket.
So, wow, I was a little surprised by that because it sounds like there's some power players must be in the top of the Democrat round that don't want Kamala Harris either, want to replace them both. Do you think that's even a viable possibility?
No, because the money's not there. I mean, if you keep Kamala Harris in there, she has access to that $250 million war chest that Biden and Kamala Harris have built up. I don't see how they would be able to recreate the ground game, recreate the personnel, get the money back in the coffers to be able to take on Donald Trump. To have a whole new ticket would be crazy. I mean, I know there's this talk, Danny, about some sort of open convention, some lightning, primary at the DNC or something else. That will rip the Democratic Party apart. There are some major fissures within the Democratic Party between conservative Democrats, which isn't many left, but moderates, which used to be the Obamas and the Clintons, and then the progressives and more really far left progressives like AOC or Bernie Sanders and others. And I think we need to remember one point. This is important, Danny. I want to mention this. How did we get Joe Biden as president of the United States? How did we even get him as the Democratic nominee? Well, go back and remember it was Bernie Sanders who seemed like he was walking on the way with the nomination, and Biden was limping into South Carolina.
Right, I remember that.
Remember? And that's and all of a sudden Joe Biden was pushed forward as this alternative. So the really hardcore progressives didn't take over the Democratic Party because they felt that they would lose to Donald Trump. So I think we have to remember how we got here, and that a lot of these problems within the Democratic Party civil war between the centrists and the far left progressives is not over. It's just been kind of put on a giant pause. And I think AOC is really starting to try to point this out and kind of warning Democrats, like, look, if you try to replace the whole ticket, all bets are basically off. And I mean, I really do think they should go with Kamala Harris. And look, Kamala Harris has a lot of problems, but I think if she was focused, if she studied her brief, if she came into things prepared, which I think she has been over the last couple of weeks, she could be a formal opponent to Donald Trump. She could. But she's got
some of the polling before the assassination attempt. I saw some of the polling of if that had happened, and it was surprisingly close. In fact, some of them even had her on top. So I agree with you that if she presents herself well, it still could be a formidable challenge.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with you.
But we will wait and see on that. But it's because a lot of people are saying, I think the Washington Post and Fox News last night and some other outlets are saying that it seems that there's a better than 50-50 chance that by the end of the weekend, some kind of announcement is made from the White House. We'll have to wait and see what that happens, and probably we'll want you back on whenever that does. Well, listen,
right,
thanks, Harry, for coming on today. Really appreciate these great insights here, and we're going to continue to monitor this stuff for you like we always do. Invite you to come back at 3 o'clock this afternoon, folks, because we're going to have another one of our famous Intel briefs where we showed you the best of what you may have missed during the week and some new information that you may not be aware of. So tune back in at 3 o'clock today. Be sure to like and subscribe, and we will look forward to seeing you at 3 o'clock on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.